He really wanted. The Prime Minister endured 24 hours of resignations and refusals, with her authority once again being questioned. Today, though, the focus was on her junior ministers. So, who's in, who's out? We'll hear from our political editor, Robert Peston, in just a moment. First, here's our political correspondent, Carl Dinnan.
Meeting for the first time this morning, Theresa May's new-look cabinet. Except it didn't look all that new. Greg Clark in the glasses still runs business because Jeremy Hunt, on the left and in front of Mrs May, didn't want to leave his job at Health. It wasn't the only move that went wrong. Mrs May wanted Justine Greening to take over at Work and Pensions. Ms Greening said no and left the government.
I did what I thought the right thing to do was. Thank you.
She enjoyed a run this morning rather than a cabinet meeting. That means Esther McVey is the new Work and Pensions Secretary.
There's lots of energy, there's lots of ideas. It was a really important meeting this morning and a sense of renewed vigour.
Things also worked out rather well for Matt Hancock, the brand new Culture Secretary.
I thought the reshuffle was excellent yesterday.
Today's cabinet was not notably more diverse than it was before, although the new party chairman pointed to an improved gender balance.
What we have got is we've got a lady as Prime Minister, Theresa May is a woman as Prime Minister, we've got a woman as our Home Secretary, we've got more women around the Cabinet table for our Cabinet meeting this morning than we've had before. And actually, as I say, we're only part way through the reshuffle. So as we see those appointments through the Parliamentary Under-Secretaries and Ministers' State, we'll see more fresh new talent coming in.
So junior ministers Robert Goodwill, Mark Garnier, John Hayes and Philip Dunn all left government this morning. Amongst those who got new jobs were Alok Sharma and Joe Johnson. Mr Johnson moved to transport from universities, where one of his last acts had been the controversial hiring of journalist Toby Young as a university regulator. Mr Young resigned this morning. The sense of anticlimax that has surrounded this reshuffle is in part because expectations had been allowed to build of a new-look government. But one of Mrs May's predecessors as Tory leader says that could still be on the way.
It was a reshuffle, it just wasn't a major reshuffle of cabinet. But in the ministerial role, I think what's going to happen, you'll find a lot of new faces will come in, people from the latest intake and the intake before, because it's from those that you will then have the chance eventually to refresh cabinet in a year's time or so.
And who knows if a future leader of the Tory party, perhaps even a future Prime Minister, will be amongst those coming and going from Downing Street this afternoon. Carl Dinnan, ITV News, Westminster.
Let's go live to Downing Street and join our political editor, Robert Peston. Is this reshuffle anything more than rearranging MPs' job titles this time?
Well, we're promised it will be later in the day. We are expecting some young blood, as it were, backbenchers who won seats in 2015 and 2017 to enter government. But so far, it is, frankly, a rearranging of relatively familiar faces. Joe Johnson, the relatively well-known universities minister, going to transport and also becoming minister for London. People like Sam Gyimah and Margot James simply being moved. So at the moment, the composition of the government looks much as it was. There are some ministers out. Mark Garnier, who was cleared on sort of allegations of sexual harassment, has now been sacked, although wasn't sacked when the sexual harassment thing was an issue. Philip Dunn, Health Minister, who only yesterday courted controversy by pointing to the number of chairs there were in hospitals for people to sit on, has gone today. Difficult to know whether that was planned or that was punishment. Now, the other thing which is happening relating to this whole issue of previous misbehaviour by ministers is the ministerial code is being tightened up. So you'll remember Priti Patel was sacked only a few weeks ago for inappropriate meetings she had with members of the Israeli government. There will be new rules on disclosure of meetings of that sort, and also new rules on what counts as bullying and sexual harassment. And the whole cabinet has been told they have to read the new guidelines and follow them.
Robert Peston, thank you. There were historic scenes on the border of North and South Korea today after a face-to-face meeting took place between the warring nations for the first time in more than 2 years. Handshakes between dignitaries signified the momentous change in mood as Pyongyang agreed to send a delegation to this year's Winter Olympic Games taking place in the south. Our correspondent Debbie Edward is in Seoul for us now. Just how significant are the agreements reached today, Debbie?
Well, this was a day full of symbolic significance from the very start, with the North Korean delegation making that gesture of walking across the military demarcation line into South Korea, into Truce Village, Panmunjom, and then into Peace House, where they shook hands with their South Korean opposite numbers. And it was within just a couple of hours of that handshake that we heard that an agreement had been reached for North Korea to send a delegation, including athletes, to the Winter Games in just 4 weeks' time. That was our first indication that progress was going to be made today. And then in the last hour, we've had a statement released from both sides in which they said that the dialogue will continue and that in the coming weeks and months they will be holding military talks. South Korea is delighted that their peace games are now on track, but today there was no mention of North Korea's nuclear program. Kim Jong-un has stated he is still determined to mass produce missiles and nuclear warheads in the coming year, and South Korea will have to address that. But perhaps today was all about getting North Korea back round the table. That was today's priority, and the most pressing of issues, the nuclear program, can be addressed further down the line.
Interesting times. Debbie Edward in Seoul, thank you very much. Thank you. And later in the programme, we'll be speaking to the man leading Team GB at the Winter Games about British medal hopes. Before that, the trial of the former football coach Barry Bennell has begun in Liverpool today, with the prosecution accusing the 63-year-old of being a predatory and determined paedophile who systematically abused young boys. The former Crewe Alexandra coach is accused of 48 counts of child sexual abuse. Our sports editor, Steve Scott, is outside Liverpool Crown Court. Steve, talk us through the evidence so far.
Yeah, well, Nina, the judge swore in 7 women and 5 men to the jury this morning. Before the prosecution began to outline its case, he told them that they should not be intimidated by the high-profile nature of this case. The prosecution then began to outline its case, saying that Barry Bennell was a youth football coach in the Derbyshire, Cheshire and Manchester area in the 1970s and through to the 1990s. The prosecution barrister, Nick Johnson QC, said as such he had unfettered access to large numbers of young lads who dreamt of a life in professional football. Though it seems Mr. Bennell was a skilled and relatively successful coach, we allege that he had a much darker side. He was also, we say, a predatory and determined paedophile. His particular predilection was pre-pubescent boys. Well, the prosecution claims that the abuse mainly took place at Bennell's various homes, but also when he took teams on tour and also at Crewe Alexandra Football Club's training ground. Bennell denies a total of 48 charges. The prosecution said today that he will claim that in the past he's always admitted to any offences that have been put to him. And in this case, the 11 complainants, well, they're just jumping on the bandwagon. They're either seeking attention or actually seeking compensation. His trial is expected to last here in Liverpool for about 8 weeks.
Steve Scott, many thanks. Still to come, British actors lead the nominations at this year's BAFTAs, but all the talk is of the woman who'll present the awards. And why the sand is proving too hot for these green turtles. But first, while the country's food retailers might have enjoyed a bumper Christmas, it turns out our festive food fix left little room in our wallets for much else. Figures out today show like-for-like sales of non-food items recorded the largest fall since records began. Joe Partridge reports on the continued squeeze on consumer spending.
In the bleak light of January, time to count the cost of Christmas for consumers and retailers alike. But this year, amid rising prices and stagnant wages, shoppers reined in their spending. UK retail sales rose slightly in December compared with a year earlier. But in-store spending on non-food products fell by 4.4%, the biggest slide since records began 5 years ago.
For non-food, it's much more discretionary spend, so things like jewellery and toys, and that's where, because people's personal disposable incomes are under a bit of pressure, they are spending a little bit less.
Morrison's was one of the festive success stories. Britain's fourth biggest supermarket had a better Christmas than predicted, and sales in their stores rose 2.1% over the festive season.
Consumers like to fill their trolleys with groceries at Christmas, and that's given supermarkets like Morrison's a sales boost. But the retail story of this Christmas is shaping up to be the widening gap between sales of food and non-food items. Inflation's at an almost 6-year high, consumers are tightening their belts, and they might be able to make do without new clothing or electronics, but they have to keep buying food.
Records are enjoying a resurgence, but hobbies definitely fall into discretionary spending.
Do I really need that item? And if I'm still thinking about it a week later, then I probably need that item.
I think you have to be quite strict with yourself about how much you're going to spend. Like, I always take the cash out rather than using my card.
This record shop finds even in straitened times, vinyl fans will save up.
This is a luxury item, essentially. And I think what people are doing is they're saying, OK, I need to spend money on this, this and this, but you know, life's an experience. This is fantastic experience. I really want that stuff. I will make time and I will put some money aside to buy myself a treat.
Before Christmas, many stores relied on discounts to pull in shoppers, and that's already led to some profit warnings. Some of the biggest high street names will tell us this Thursday what kind of Christmas they had. Joanna Partridge, ITV News.
Next, following the awards and the protests at the Golden Globe Awards, the BAFTA nominations have been announced today. The same cloud of sexual harassment allegations and gender inequality hangs over the British Film Awards. So it's probably no surprise that a woman has replaced the male host of 12 Years, Stephen Fry. Joanna Lumley is the woman in question. Nina Nana was at BAFTA when the nominations were announced a little earlier. Look, a different award ceremony that we're talking about, but very much the same focus on what's going on within the industry.
Indeed, you know, at the start of proceedings this morning, BAFTA announced that it would be publishing a new set of guidelines on a code of conduct in the workplace, and that is coming in the next few weeks. But rather pointedly, the nominations were made this morning by 2 women. And then the news, of course, that Stephen Fry, we know, is stepping down from hosting BAFTA. He's been doing it for 12 years. He will be replaced by a woman, Joanna Lumley, who told me this morning that she thought it was a timely move.
I think we've got so used to Stephen, who's a man anyway, doing it, that you think it's kind of a man job. But as soon as they sort of explained and went, well, this is an important thing because Stephen's stepping down anyway, and it's 100 years since women got the vote, and so it's an important thing, we'd like to make it a woman thing. Then they hadn't finished the sentence before I went, yes, make it me, please make it me.
And it was, of course, one change there to reflect the current climate. What about the nominations themselves?
Well, very interesting set of nominations. Leading the nominations, we've got the fantasy film The Shape of Water. That has got 12 nominations, including one for British actress Sally Hawkins. And I have to say that a lot of the films do feature very strong roles for women this year, so that is something that is very, very noticeable. But in the Best Director category, as with the Golden Globes, it is all male. There are no